But hi, everybody. I'm Clinton Dexter Nienhaus, MC for this here event. We're going to get started. We're going to get going. The schedule as it reads is still as we have it. If I have updates for the schedule on your handouts, I will make sure to give updates as we go throughout the day. But hopefully we'll be able to keep things right on time as we go. And so we're going to start with Tim. So Tim Mitchell is Loon Program Coordinator for the Minnesota DNR. We're going to hear about more about loons, really, but as Loon Program Coordinator for the Minnesota DNR, Tim is involved in all things related to loons in our state, including research, habitat acquisition, outreach, and other conservation efforts focused on our beloved state bird. Tim grew up in Minnesota, but his career's brought him to different corners of the country working on diverse wildlife, including owls, turtles, lizards, pollinators, and now loons. He's got a degree from St. Olaf and a PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior from Iowa State. Tim.
Hello, can you hear me all? Can you all hear me? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Welcome. I'm excited to be here and talking about what the Minnesota DNR has been up to for the last 5 years and even further back working with common loons and the restoration of common loons. So I started at the DNR about 10 months ago, so most of what I'm talking about has occurred long before I started there. So at the end I have an acknowledgement slide, but this is the work of many people that I'm talking about. So I'll start with just a little bit of background on the loon, particularly in its biology in Minnesota. So we think there are about 12,000 adult loons that come to Minnesota every year and breed. That's about 2% of the world population. The orange on the top here is the breeding range of the common loon, and you can see it covers portions of the northern states, most of Canada, and a lot of Alaska. So we have more loons than any state besides Alaska, and of course it is our beloved state birds. This breeding range in Minnesota comes down to about central Minnesota now, but they used to breed as far south as northern Iowa. So there's been some range contraction in the last 100 or so years. And their non-breeding range covers the rest of the United States during their migratory routes. A lot of that is where they're flying over, and then they winter on the Gulf and southern Atlantic coast primarily. The birds from Minnesota, this shows from radio-tagged, satellite-tagged birds. Their general migration routes of birds tagged in Minnesota tend to head over to Lake Michigan in early fall. Loons do not just head south quickly. They'll go and they'll forage for a while, and then they'll do a big flight, find another place, forage for a while. So this migration on the way south takes quite a while they're foraging along the way. When they come back up, they usually come up much more quickly. The adults leave prior to the juveniles, so the adults will leave their natal lakes several weeks or even months before their juveniles will, and then the juveniles have to follow along without having guides, so they figure it out. And you can see that Minnesota's loons tend to go down to the Gulf. That's where most of the loons that we have will spend the winter. They're probably on their way down there, possibly on southern reservoirs, or making their way there very soon. I'm just going to go through a little bit of Minnesota loon phenology and their life history with pictures. So shortly after ice out, loons, the adult sexually mature loons, which are usually about 4 years old, so the first several summers, the juveniles will stay down on the coast during the winter until they're sexually mature, when they'll come back up to try to establish breeding territories. So these sexually mature loons will come up and they will have potentially fierce territorial battles. There are not that many animals that fight to the death. Loons are among them. So there is mortality every year from these territorial battles. This is a photograph of the breastplate of a loon, and those are puncture wounds from bills of other loons. And so many loons have scars, so they may survive that, but they also fight to the death. So that's a interesting part of loon biology. And some of the reason we think this happens is they have such a long takeoff runway that it's hard for them to escape a fight when they're losing, and they also actually have a lethal weapon as a bill, which many animals don't have. So that's some of the things you might be seeing early in the season. Loon nesting. So loons can hardly walk. They really can't walk. They sort of can push themselves along the ground, so their nests are very close to the water. This is a typical natural loon nest. They nest on shore. They like small islands, floating aquatic vegetation like this, and the pair will set up these nests. And like I said previously, they are territorial, so if you find a loon nest, there are unlikely to be other loons very close by because they will not tolerate others in their territory. Here's another pic of a natural nest with the eggs in it. They typically lay 1 to 2 eggs, and they will re-nest after early nest failure. So if something causes a nest failure early in their incubation, they will try to nest again. If they have already hatched chicks, they usually will not, or they won't re-nest again. But that's why sometimes you see staggered chick size. If you're out, you're like, well, there's a chick that looks 5, 6, 7 weeks old and one that just hatched. Well, sometimes that's because one pair may have re-nested, and so they might be several weeks later. The main things that cause nest failure are things like predators. So these can be mammalian or avian predators. Water fluctuations, so big rains or rising waters can flood nests. Flies, so there is a loon-specific black fly that will absolutely bombard loons when the hatch occurs, and they will drive incubating loons off the nest. They have no way to continue incubating and seek shelter, so that's a big cause of failure, and then other weather generally. Here's a photo of a chick on its parent's back, and so once chicks hatch, of course, they are very needy, and they have good parents that do a good job of feeding them. But chick mortality usually comes from also predators, which are primarily avian or fish predators. Small loons like that can be taken by fish. Boat strikes and things of that nature can cause problems for loons, as well as weather events when they're really young like that. Chicks need to grow fast before fall. The chicks that were born this spring are on their way south right now, and it is a race to get large enough and healthy enough to make that migration. And so it is, of course, a full-time job for these parents feeding the loons. By August, you usually see chicks foraging much more for themselves, so it sort of shifts how much food is coming from parents and how much they're hunting for themselves. But if you're watching loons in midsummer, you're likely to see a lot of this. A common thing to see in sort of mid to late summer, July, August, is these social gatherings. So these are typically loons that did not successfully reproduce, so they either never established a territory or their chicks failed for one reason or another. And so these are gatherings of non-reproductive adults. They forage together. They might be scouting territories they might want to take over in the future. Things like that. And then in fall, the parents or the adults end up in some pretty big congregations. So you can see this is on Cross Lake in October, but sometimes you'll see dozens to hundreds of loons collectively foraging together when they're getting ready for that migration. So that's just a little background on loons in Minnesota, and now we're going to talk a little bit about this loon restoration project that I've been involved in. So in 2010, there was the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which damaged a lot of the Gulf and a lot of wildlife, including a lot of common loons. And Minnesota was involved, the Minnesota DNRs and others were involved in a study to sort of demonstrate that the loons that were harmed there are indeed loons from Minnesota. And so starting around 2010, there was this project where there was a lot of captures on loons in Minnesota lakes, which we used satellite telemetry, geolocators, and then also contaminant studies on loons. I'm not going to go into all the cool stuff we learned about loons from that, but the highlights are that that we demonstrated that indeed Minnesota's loons migrate to the Gulf, and contaminants from that oil spill were in Minnesota's loons, which sort of proved that our loons were affected, which allowed us to get the state of Minnesota to get mitigation funds from the Deepwater Horizon settlement. So we are partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey. There are some long-term loon biologists there that have been really good at good partners for that, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So this project started around 2020, and the goals for this restoration fund are, first and foremost, to acquire and protect lakeshore nesting and foraging habitat for loons. Secondly is to enhance common loon habitat and increase lake stewardship. There's two ways we do that. We provide support for lake associations and lake management plans, as well as a scientific study about the use of artificial nesting platforms, which I'll talk about more, and then also reducing lead exposure for loons through the advocacy of non-toxic tackle. I'm going to go over this slide briefly, but basically the DNR already has a system in place to rank lands that they may want to acquire. We worked within that system and added some multipliers to make sure lands that were suitable for the DNR generally were getting added bonus points for being good loon habitat. So working within that system, we looked to acquire land. I work for the non-game wildlife program. We don't manage much land ourselves, and so we wanted to make sure that these lands were suitable for becoming either wildlife management areas or aquatic management areas with some particular loon considerations. So we have successfully acquired 4 different parcels already, which collectively protects 6.5 miles of shoreline in Minnesota. That includes a really large acquisition on Mantrap Lake in Hubbard County. 3M used to own huge chunk of their shoreline, and the Loon program partnered with other folks to, and other DNR groups to acquire a huge chunk of that shoreline. And we also have some other ones across north central Minnesota counties, and there's 2 more in progress as we're winding down. So we've been excited about those great acquisitions that we've been able to make with that funding. So that was the first goal of our project. The second goal is broken down into 2 pieces, and one of them is this lake association outreach. And so we have over 50 lake associations we partner with where the DNR supports the lake associations. We get them to participate in our volunteer Loon Watch program, which gives us intel on the breeding of the loons in their lakes. We help them with these loon-friendly lake management plans, so educating people on like the value of aquatic vegetation. A lot of people like clearing that out away from their docks, but a lot of those floating vegetation mats, which maybe aren't great for swimming, are exactly what the loons need, so educating people on that. And then what we call Be Loon Aware, we have pamphlets and education campaigns just evaluating the impacts of your own recreation. So fast boats, jet skis, wakes, fishing, and just bird watching, kayaking, and looking up at birds that are sitting on nests can be ways that you might be disturbing this wildlife. So sort of getting that out. And like I said, we've got over 50 lake associations we work with, and we go around and give presentations, support them in any ways we can. The second thing about this habitat restoration part of it is our artificial nesting platform study. So artificial nesting platform is pretty much a birdhouse for loons. They come in a lot of different designs. This is just one pictured, and it's the type we're using in our study, but it's basically a floating platform that might mimic floating aquatic vegetation that is a place loons might nest. Pictured here are 2 membranes from chicks, from the eggs that are left behind, which is evidence that they had successfully hatched 2 chicks off this artificial nesting platform. So that's what's pictured here. Nesting platforms are not a replacement for quality habitat, but they are a tool that we use under certain circumstances, and we want to better understand how that tool can be used for conservation. The main 2 factors that cause nest failure that nesting platforms help with are mammalian predation and water fluctuation. So if you have raccoons and skunks and you know that and they've been eating nests, or you have rapid water fluctuations and that has caused nest failure, sometimes a nesting platform might be the appropriate tool for conservation. So our main objective was to use these nesting platforms to put more loons on the landscape. But then our second goal within that is to assess how these nesting platforms are working, and that's the work we're doing now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, this is the one scientific experiment study that we have going on out of this, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that worked. So to select lakes for the study, we wanted to use lakes where we already knew loons were there and that they had relatively low reproductive output. So there may have been a reason for a conservation tool to be used. These lakes could not be involved in other studies and occurred in our 8-county study area pictured there in northern Minnesota. The little red triangles are lakes that are in our study. And then within these territories, so you've got lakes and then territories within lakes, we wanted to make sure there weren't nesting platforms, ANPs, artificial nesting platforms, already present in those territories, and that it was a single lake territory. Some loons use multiple lakes as their territory, but we had to use, we wanted loons that were only using one lake for chick rearing. So we had over 100 territories and 60 lakes after this selection process. In 21 and 22, we monitored all these territories to get background data on reproduction and nest site choice and things like that. Monitoring includes visiting lakes every week and assessing territory occupancy, nesting activity, nesting success, and chick survival. So this is Luke Farrer from the USGS. He was my close colleague this summer, and he's spying on a loon on a nest here on Cross Lake. These surveys occur weekly, May through August. So we're on the water all summer. And we use motorboats, kayaks, and also shoreline observations depending on what the lake is like. So out of these about 100 territories, we selected 45 that got nesting platforms and about 54 as controls. Those numbers fluctuate a little bit every year because sometimes a territory is not occupied, all sorts of various reasons, but about half and half nesting platforms and controls. We coordinated with volunteers to deploy these nesting platforms. We started that in 2023, so in 2023, 45 territories got about 45 territories got these nesting platforms. We used prior monitoring data as our main factor for where to put these nesting platforms, so we put them near where we knew loons nested or had attempted to nest in the past. And then other factors like disturbance, like are they next to main boating channels, nest depth, distance to shore, things like that. And again, we did that same approach where we surveyed for occupancy, nesting, chick survival for the last 3 summers. Right here, this is Luke and I out on Cross Lake, and right in the middle in the back, we have just deployed a nesting platform or moved it into position. This just shows you a little bit of the type of data we get. This is Cross Lake in central Minnesota. And so this is our mapping software. A blue dot represents where we saw an adult loon. This is it throughout the whole summer. So blue dot clusters is where that pair was repeatedly hanging out. Those aren't all loons that were there at the same time. Purple dots are where we saw chicks. Green, a green square like that is a nest. And so a green square with a blue dot shows that we saw a bird incubating a nest. It's that kind of type of thing. So Cross Lake has 9 territories, which you can sort of see outlined here. Those are the different territories. And like we said, we had this last summer we surveyed about 130 territories. So it's a pretty big effort going to all these places across the state over the summer. We are not done analyzing our results from this. The USGS is primarily doing that, but the general questions we hope to address, the main thing is how many more loons are we producing with this conservation action than we would have without them? And so that's why we had a few years of monitoring before, and we're doing it now. But then there's some sub-questions we may be able to get into, like what sort of lake characteristics influence productivity, and what other factors are influencing reproductive success. I can give you some very interesting preliminary results that are nesting platform use is increasing, and so it takes loons a while to warm up to the idea of a nesting platform in their territory. And so in 2023, we had 42 nesting platforms out, and only one was used. And yet you can see each year that use has gone up. And so we're trying to support our volunteers to get them all back out in the same places this next year, and see if that use continues to go up or if it sort of plateaus, which would be interesting to us. The third goal of our restoration project is outreach around lead fishing tackle. So we are hoping to reduce lead exposure of loons through the advocacy of non-toxic tackle. There's sort of two routes that lead gets into loons. One is them foraging on the bottom for stones for their gizzard, and then the other is eating fish that already have lead tackle ingested, maybe a line broke or something like that. And so those are the main routes of exposure. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has primarily led this effort. They distribute non-toxic sample tackle to all across the state and do a whole lot of education and outreach. They currently have a grant program to get brick and mortar tackle shops across northern Minnesota to have non-toxic offerings in their stores. This is just a photo of what was removed from a loon's gizzard in a necropsy, and you can see these are lead fishing tackle, the arrows, and then all those are stones. And so you can see that there's that route of exposure from lead, a legacy of lead tackle sitting on the bottom of lakes. And of course, fishing hooks and line can also be a problem. This loon died, and you can see there's a fishing hook on its beak. It got tangled in fishing line. So the future, where are we going now? That restoration fund was a 5-year project. It's basically ending now. It's in our last year of funding. So what is the program doing now? We're hoping to continue a lot of the efforts and the momentum we've built with our restoration project. So the local soccer team, Minnesota United Soccer Team's license plates, they are the Loons, and the license plates come to the Loon Restoration Program at the Minnesota DNR. So that is outstanding. It has allowed the position that I'm in to be funded beyond the end of this project. And we're in a somewhat of a transition phase where we're coming off of this restoration fund and finding new avenues to do loon conservation in the state. We're going to try to continue this nesting platform support in our study, but the main takeaway from that is how we can help lake citizens decide when and where to use nesting platforms, if they are right for their lake, things like that. And we do a lot of outreach. Again, we're with the Non-Game Wildlife Program, and we are primarily a donation-based group at the DNR, and so we appreciate license plates. License plate sales are a major way we get funding, as well as donations. And so with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up. Like I said, we have a lot of partners and contributors. The U.S. Geological Survey, the Minnesota DNR has been involved in this work that I've been describing for the last 15 years. Carol Henderson, I see, is back there. He started a lot of this stuff, so I'm sure he knows a lot more about it than I do. And so many people at the DNR, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and again, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. If you have questions about that work that was done in the 2010s, radio tags, all that stuff, Carol is heavily involved in that, and I've had coffee with him a couple times, and he has some great stories from there. So he's back there in the booth. Go talk to him. And with that, I'd like to thank you and take any questions.
Okay, for questions, I've got a microphone. Dick King has a microphone. Please raise your hand and we'll come find you. So I think we've got one behind you, Dick, right now, but here's Michelle.
A quick question about how the platforms are constructed, and do you anchor them at a location, and like how far do you put them out from shoreline?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are many designs. What we use is a PVC structure filled with spray foam and real foam connected together and anchored with concrete blocks. So we have ropes that go down and anchor them. The distance from shore is very flexible because the literature and what we see is the best time to use them is already near where loons are trying to nest and failing. So sometimes if it's emergent vegetation that is well separated from shore, we might put it out a fair bit from shore, but ideally near, so sometimes it'll nest on islands or things like that. So the first consideration is how close to the loons, but I get a lot of calls that are like, hey, we want to put one of those off the end of our dock because we want to watch loons, and it doesn't work that way. And so that's a lot of the type of, it's a conservation tool, but there's ways that it can be used where it'll actually help, and so that's a lot of the insights we're doing. So we're pretty flexible on how far from shore, but the raccoons and skunks and those sorts of predators really don't like to swim. They swim some, but getting them a ways off is helpful. There's minks and otters that it does nothing for, and of course, these other animals can swim, but usually when it's off the shore, they just don't smell it and know that it's there. Yeah.
Do you have any issues with the ANPs with other birds like geese or swans trying to take over?
We have seen one of the ANPs that was used by loons this year had a single goose egg in it, which we found odd. The loons were there and a goose laid in eggs. They've been used, but I think the loons they're there very early, and I think they're pretty territorial, and usually a goose or a duck does it. We haven't seen them edging out loons that want to use it, in my experience anyway. Eagles are a concern. We have if I go back, we have eagle guards, which I can't see my mouse here. Oh, there we go. So these vertical PVC with ropes across are to try to reduce eagle predation so they don't have a clear shot at a bird. But really, the eagles are going to know they're there, of course, but getting that muck and vegetation to grow up also helps the loon feel a little more secure in that nest.
Any sampling of the oil, the impact of the oil, was there any samples from these birds that you did see at all? In other words, one of the reasons you did this is because the oil, so is it getting less over time in the birds?
I don't know the answer to that question. We know the oil killed a lot of birds initially in the Gulf, and that there was evidence that so we more or less use that as evidence that they our loons, Minnesota's loons, were down there. I don't think we had a rigorous enough time series of we know this bird had oil and what were the results on its offspring. So I think we don't know the answer to that question. They could have had those effects, but we don't know.
Good presentation. Any thoughts on how the proliferation of wake boats in the state have impacted nesting loons?
I don't have data on that, but we know that wake boats reduce water clarity as they stir up the bottom. Loons are primarily visual predators, so reductions in water clarity would be bad for rearing loons. And we know that eggs can get knocked off these shallow nests, and so I'm sure it has an impact. We don't have a study engaged on exactly how that is. There's anecdotal reports of that, so I'm sure it's reducing nesting success and potentially chick growth rates, things like that. But I don't have data to speak on that.
Can you give us an update on what might be happening to ban lead tackle? I mean, it's been going on for years, and it seems like a logical solution, just not make it anymore.
Yeah, so that's legislative. So the DNR doesn't do the rulemaking on that aspect, and so that is something that's occurring in the legislature every year, which is why we have the approach of education on using tackle. I don't have updates specifically on what's coming up this year and what's going on. I've been digging through our old necropsy files to try to get a sense of how we have. I'm not sure exactly how many loons we have necropsy files for. I just picked them up from Carol a few weeks ago, but I'm starting to go through those, which will give us a sort of sense of loons that turn up dead and show up. How many of those are due to fishing tackle and lead fishing tackle due to other causes? So I don't have any, that's what I know, so I don't know where you're at in it, yeah.
Thank you, Tim.
Yep, thank you very much.